Hello there, and welcome back to the Judge program for Star Wars Unlimited Apprentice Lesson Track. As always, I'm your host, Jonah, and today we'll be talking about teaching and demoing Star Wars Unlimited. We're starting with this, rather than a deep dive into the rules or explanations of policy, because the fundamental role of a judge is educating players and helping people better understand how the game works. Being able to explain the core concepts and understanding how different people learn is foundational to developing that skill. Some of the questions that we're going to address today include, how should you structure teaching the game? Do you think it's better to start with setup or how to win the game? If a player is using technically incorrect language but understands the concepts, should you correct them? How should you go about getting players to understand the deeper strategy that Star Wars Unlimited offers? Once a player has gotten their grips on the game, how should you wrap up the demo? There will be some tips and pointers that can be used generically for teaching and explaining games, but we'll also go into a bit more detail for Star Wars Unlimited in particular and put those best practices into context. Before you talk about rules or deck construction or mechanics or really any element of the game, spend a moment to figure out what has already hooked the player's attention. If you're at a game store, it's probably the Star Wars theme that appeals, as there are plenty of other card games there. If you're at a Star Wars convention, on the other hand, it's probably the card game aspect that is particularly interesting to them. This is also a great time to ask them a few questions to get an idea of who they are as a player. Do they have a lot of knowledge of the property and characters? Have they played other similar games? These questions help you better understand your audience and how to engage them effectively. Now, part of understanding a game is having an appropriate context for the pieces of it. As an extreme example, if you start by saying, if you use ECL to give the gorilla attack pod ambush, you can resolve your triggers so that you're potentially able to attack with it twice. Your audience will have no idea what you're saying, and even if they do recognize some of the words, they don't really understand the importance of it as a newer player. This means, somewhat strangely, we're going to have to start with the end of the game, introducing the greatest scope. An introduction of, you're going to have a deck that features a leader commanding their units in battle and trying to destroy the enemy's base, whose hit points total is indicated by this number, is a great way to begin. Now the player has the context of what their goal is and what tools they have at hand. Embed the story as a part of the game, because Star Wars Unlimited is a great way to tell new stories in this amazing universe. Imagine the timeline where Kira is defending Echo Base on Hoth and helping Leia lead an attack on the Death Star. It's also generally helpful to use the language of the game itself. Leaders and bases, units and events, resources and action phases. This helps the player better understand what the cards themselves are saying as they start to read more and listen to you less. However, as with all rules, there is an exception. If you're working with just one player, using the language that they're familiar with, if you both have experience with another TCG, can help quickly explain concept topics. These can be terms like monster, inking, tapping and untapping. In particular, you do not need to correct a player's language if they're using the wrong terms. Just make sure to point out the differences, such as any card being able to be a resource and units always entering play exhausted. This is true when answering a judge call as well. As long as the players at the table understand what is happening, the language doesn't need to be technical. Also, be careful with colloquial terms as well. Bounce, mill, scoop, buff. These are all phrases that you or players might know, but if not everyone knows them, then it can feel like people are speaking another language and end up being exclusionary. With the endgame goal established, work back from there. If the goal is to destroy the base, how do you damage it? At this point, explaining how attacking units work sets up the next question. How do I get units into play? Once you've briefly explained playing cards and events, all that's left is the last few details of mechanical action, how the turn passes back and forth, and the regroup phase. With the basics in hand, it's time to play a game. Either play the game with the student or have two new players play against each other, depending on how many people are interested in learning and how many decks you have. Most people learn better from playing, but if someone just wants to watch, give a gentle nudge, but don't insist that they play. Start playing and go through each step of a round, announcing what you're doing and reminding players of the options they have at hand. Take it slowly and be ready for any questions the players have. And I do mean any questions. As mentioned above, start by introducing the core concept. You're taking control of a leader and using their units to destroy your opponent's base. In this intro, you don't need to talk about aspects, aspect penalties, or base abilities unless someone asks, but even then, it's not necessary for playing right away, and it's extra information that you don't need them to keep track of. From there, you can dive right into the back and forth nature of the game. Rather than introduce the 5 key actions, focus on the ones that are relevant. For most decks, attacking with a unit and using an ability won't be possible on the first turn. However, as options become available, explain what they are as briefly as you can. Play a card. This can either be an event that does something immediately but doesn't stick around, or a unit that you can use to attack your opponent's units and base. Notably, some demo decks might not have upgrades, and if yours don't, you don't need to touch on them now at all. Attack with a unit. While units come into play exhausted, if it's not exhausted, you can attack a unit or base directly. Attacked units will deal damage back, and damage is persistent. It doesn't go away unless healed. Use an ability. Most leaders have these, so that's a great place to point them out. Any card with the bolded action ability has an ability you can activate. Pass. Just do nothing and see what your opponent is going to do. But if they pass, the round ends, and you don't get an opportunity to do anything more this round. And finally, claim the initiative. This means you'll go first next round, but you also pass for the rest of this round, and your opponent gets to take as many turns as they want. Play out the whole action phase before explaining any of the regroup phase. Once you've both completed your turns, now you can explain this process. Each player draws 2 cards, plays up to 1 card as a resource, and then readies everything that was exhausted. Introduce mechanics as they come up. You'll want to start the game by explaining that you draw an opening hand of 6 cards and play 2 cards as resources. Because this is a learning opportunity, this is a great time to play with hands face up, or at least your hand. You can show them what you're doing and explain, briefly, why you're resourcing those cards or choosing that card to play. This gives them context, but doesn't cost them a strategic advantage. Of course, if they play with their hand revealed, you can also give them better advice. Explain that units and resources come into play exhausted when the first units are played, not before. By giving information one step at a time, it's easier to put it into context rather than trying to understand the game as a whole in one massive step. Similarly, you can explain that damage persists the first time it comes up, and talk about leader deployment around turn 3 or 4, maybe 5, when players are first getting to the point where they can be deployed. You don't have to explain keywords if they're not in the decks or never drawn. If grit or smuggle never shows up, that's information the player doesn't need to know to play this game. Remember, your goal is to make sure that they have a good time playing the game and want to play more, not make them ready for a tournament. Demoing a game for a newer audience is different from teaching experienced players, and it's very, very different from teaching your friends. There are a lot of small things that you can do that might not feel natural at first, but can drastically improve the player experience. Don't try to teach mastery. It's okay if players make strategic blunders. One way for a player to get frustrated and quit quickly if they're constantly told what you should have done is, or even worse, told what to do before they have a chance to figure it out. They're here to play the game, not have you play it for them. You also don't need to go into details on mechanics. If somebody asks you how ambush works, you can just explain what is needed, that it lets you attack a unit when played, and you don't need to talk about how it works with other triggered abilities or other more complicated concepts. Verify communication. Different people will engage with you differently, and it's important to track when the person you're teaching doesn't understand what you're explaining. A lot of the game is dependent on understanding other elements, so if your student misses something, it can hinder their understanding of those other mechanics. Sometimes the word okay or sure can mean that they understand what you're saying, but sometimes it means they've just heard you and are processing. It can take a few minutes and a few back and forth exchanges before you understand how the player learns, and it never hurts to confirm that they understand and are ready to move on. You can also always prompt your audience to see if they have any questions. Sometimes you'll just repeat yourself with a slight rephrasing and that's all they need, and other times somebody is jumping ahead on the syllabus, and that's okay too. Go in depth when asked. This ties into that previous point. If someone has a lot of experience, decades of experience with other games, maybe a game designer, someone who just knows a lot, you can meet them at their level and offer more complex answers and comparisons to other games. You don't have to keep things simple just because it's a demo, but that's where you should start. Also, if you do have a larger audience, like you might have if you're running a Learn to Play day at a store or helping out at a convention, make sure that you don't spend too much time on these more complex questions. Yes, they're interesting, but sometimes the best thing to do is acknowledge the question is interesting, but that it's a bit complex and be happy to explain it once games have started to be played. Work as a team. If you're playing the demos yourself, keep an eye on your strategic advantage. Knowing the game is a boon, even if you don't consider yourself a particularly skilled player. You don't have to lose the game on purpose, but sometimes you let the Wookiee win. Not that your student will rip your arms off, but winning your first game does feel nice. You can also ask for feedback from the people you're teaching and adapt your methodologies to what works best. Once you get games going, they don't necessarily have to conclude. People do have other things that they need or want to do, especially at large conventions, and so you don't have to have a base destroyed to end the game. Inversely, if folks are really engaged, but there's a line of other people interested in playing, you may have to cut them off after they've finished a full game rather than playing more than one. However, even when the game ends, the demo isn't over. As you've been working with the player, you've had the opportunity to evaluate them, and with that done, you can make recommendations for them based on their interest level. For many new players, picking up starter decks is a great place to begin. It allows them to play the game immediately with their friends, and the deck's functional. While there's a lot of excitement in buying packs, unless the player already has some cards or intends to play a limited format like Draft, it can be difficult to get a good starting deck out of it. On the other hand, while purchasing singles is often the most efficient way to build a competitive deck, that's often not the goal of new players, especially with a game that's as rich in lore and story as Star Wars Unlimited. Some folks may just want to slowly explore the game or personally collect all of the cards, and getting packs is a way they can do that. Similarly, if they're interested in growing their collection, going to pre-release events and store drafts is a great way to get started. There are opportunities to grow their collection and learn the game more with relatively low-stakes environments, while also not requiring significant investment, like playing in Premier or Twin Suns events, even if those events are being run at casual tier. One of the best ways to wrap up a demo is to make sure that your players know how they can play more, whether it's giving the information they need to play on their own at home, talking about upcoming events at an LGS, or something else. Letting them know when and where they can play is a top-tier opportunity for helping them get really engaged with the game. Finally, with more experienced players, there are a handful of advanced topics that you can dive into if they express interest, but you should generally avoid them with newer players. These include things like talking about the constructed meta for Premier, larger tournament offerings, and set releases coming down the pipeline in future months. That's all we have for you today. To make your demos better, you can utilize the Quick Start rules as a great jumping off point to reinforce your explanations. The other lessons in this track will also help you establish a stronger baseline that you can utilize. The next lesson will be the first one diving into the comprehensive rules, covering some of the golden rules and game structure. Good luck, and have fun.